My name is Elena Maris Cole, and I am 26 years old. If you met me today, you'd probably think I'm just another woman trying to juggle work, classes, and some semblance of a normal life. What you wouldn't see, at least not right away, is the long, ugly trail that led me here. The years spent under a roof where control was disguised as love and obedience was the only acceptable language. I didn't just walk away from my family, I ran, and I never looked back. Growing up, I learned faster than most kids that every little thing I did was under a microscope. My dad had this weird obsession with control that went way beyond strict parenting. He told me what to wear, where I could go, and who I was allowed to talk to, and he never cared how ridiculous his rules sounded. If he decided something was bad, it was bad, and I'd better go along with it unless I wanted a huge argument or worse, punishment that lingered more in my mind than on my skin. He carried himself like a judge and executioner rolled into one, always convinced he was right. My mom was a whole different story, but not in a good way. She wasn't exactly cruel like him, but she might as well have been because she never stood up for me, not once. Whatever my dad said, she just nodded along like she'd already given up the right to have her own opinion. She'd tell me that he knew best, that I should just do what he wanted, and then she'd toss in a quick, "It's for your own good," as if that magically made everything okay. It never did. It was never for my own good. It was just him on a power trip and her too scared, or too comfortable, to rock the boat. One time when I was about 14, there was this boy in my class I'd been hanging out with more. We talked during lunch, walked to classes together, normal friendship stuff. To me, it was harmless, and honestly one of the few bright spots in my day. But my dad got wind of it and twisted it in his head into something dirty and dangerous. Suddenly, in his mind, I wasn't just talking to a classmate. I was secretly dating him, sneaking around, acting fast. All those ugly words he loved to use hovered just beneath the surface. He sat me down at the kitchen table with that serious look he wore like a uniform and started in with his usual nonsense. He said I'd better not be messing around with boys. When I tried to explain that we were just friends, he got even angrier, insisting he knew exactly what kids my age were up to. The more I tried to defend myself, the more he shut me down. There was no innocent explanation he was willing to hear, only guilt he wanted me to accept. I remember my throat tightening as he went on and on, saying that if I even thought about having a relationship, he'd make sure I regretted it. It wasn't just yelling. His voice had that low, steady tone he used when he wanted me to know he was dead serious. I didn't feel like I could even defend myself anymore. So I just sat there, staring at the table, waiting for it to be over while my heart pounded so loud it drowned out half of what he said. Right on cue, my mom came in. Not to calm him down, not to ask what actually happened. She came in to add to the shame. She looked me up and down like she was inspecting damage and said I was too young to be acting that way, that I was bringing shame to the family. Shame for having a friend. Shame for walking down a hallway with a boy from my class. That was the twisted logic I grew up with. Normal teenage moments were treated like evidence in a trial I didn't know I was in. After that argument, I went straight to my room and shut the door, trying so hard not to cry loud enough for anyone to hear. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, feeling this heavy, suffocating weight settle over me. That moment was a turning point. I remember thinking, very clearly, I've got to get out of here someday. It wasn't a vague wish anymore. It was a plan being born in the quiet of my own mind. That's when I started counting down the years until I could legally leave, counting every birthday, every school year, every little milestone as one step closer to freedom. It wasn't like I was a kid who got grounded for staying out too late or punished for not doing chores. This was different. This was intimidation and control woven into the fabric of everyday life. My parents, especially my dad, were so obsessed with keeping me in line that I felt like I had zero say over my own existence. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a project, a possession, something to be managed. Another thing about my dad was how he acted like a detective, always watching, always suspicious. He'd randomly go through my stuff looking for any sign that I might be breaking one of his countless rules. I couldn't even leave a school notebook out without him flipping through it, pretending he was just checking my work. If he found something he didn't like, a doodle he didn't understand, a note from a classmate, that meant another lecture, another round of accusations. Privacy didn't exist in that house. The walls had eyes, and they all belonged to him. He even had this rule that I couldn't go to any friend's house, ever, because as he loved to say, people can't be trusted. Funny how that rule never seemed to apply to him. He could have his friends over whenever he wanted. They'd sit in the kitchen, drinking coffee, talking like they owned the place, laughing too loud while I tiptoed around them like a stranger in my own home. Meanwhile, if I so much as asked to go hang out at the mall, it was too dangerous. Apparently, the mall was some gateway to moral collapse, and I'd be tempted to do something wrong just by setting foot in a food court. Going to a simple event like a friend's birthday party? Forget it. My classmates would talk about the parties they went to, the sleepovers, the school dances, and I'd sit there forcing a smile, making up excuses about why I couldn't go. I never told them the truth, that my dad had an ironclad rule forbidding me from leaving the house for any social event that wasn't school or a medical appointment. I wasn't even allowed to go to school functions like the dance or sports games. To everyone else, I was just the weird girl who never went out. They had no idea I was living in a controlled environment that felt more like an experiment than a family. Whenever I tried to bring it up with my mom, she'd just sigh and say, "You know how your dad is," as if that explained everything. To her, his word was law, and my job was to obey without question. If I pushed back, if I dared to ask why he was like this, she'd tell me not to upset him, saying, "It's not worth it." Looking back, I think she was honestly afraid of him too. But that didn't make it any easier on me. She chose to stand by him instead of protecting me, instead of questioning his ridiculous rules. So there I was, stuck in a house where everything I did was monitored, controlled, or shut down. At school, I'd see other kids getting excited about growing up, getting their first phones, going to sleepovers, planning little trips to the movies. None of that was allowed for me. If I even mentioned wanting a phone, my dad would go on one of his epic rants about how I didn't need one and how, if you're meant to have a phone, I'll let you know. He saw my independence as a threat, not a sign that I was becoming my own person. I can't explain how isolating it felt. I was the only one I knew who couldn't even go out after school without facing an interrogation. Sometimes I'd stay late at school, pretending I needed to study, just to get a little bit of peace. I'd sit in an empty classroom, enjoying the quiet that didn't feel like judgment. Then I'd go home, bracing myself for whatever new rule or accusation my dad had cooked up that day. It was like living in a prison, where the guards shared your last name, and the sentence had no clear end date. In those years, I learned to survive by staying small, staying quiet, and building a world inside my own head. But even then, buried under all the fear and exhaustion, there was a tiny, stubborn part of me that refused to die, a part that whispered, "One day, you're getting out. One day, you're going to have a life that's actually yours." I didn't know when or how. I just knew I couldn't stay there forever. When I was 16, I thought I finally found my first real crack in the walls of that prison. It came in the form of a part-time job at a grocery store down the street from my school. Nothing glamorous, just stocking shelves, cleaning up spills, ringing up customers. But to me, it felt like a lifeline. It was mine. My application, my interview, my schedule. For the first time, I had something my dad hadn't orchestrated or approved in advance. The manager seemed decent. The hours worked around my classes, and when I got hired, I remember walking home with this strange lightness in my chest. I was 16, and that job felt like the first solid piece of proof that one day I really could build a life of my own. The idea of making my own money was intoxicating. I imagined saving up for college, maybe putting a little aside for a deposit on a place of my own when I finally turned 18. I pictured buying my own clothes without hearing commentary about what was appropriate, maybe even treating myself to a meal out with friends. It wasn't about the stuff. It was about knowing that the effort I put in would turn into something I could hold in my own hands, something that didn't have my dad's fingerprints all over it. Of course, that little taste of freedom didn't last long. The day my dad found out about the job, he didn't yell right away. That almost made it worse. He waited until after dinner, when the house was quiet and the clock in the hallway sounded so loud it made my nerves jump. He sat at the kitchen table, that same spot where so many of his talks happened, and called me in. He had this way of asking questions that felt less like curiosity and more like bait. He'd listen just long enough to look like he cared, but his mind was already made up before I opened my mouth. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, I heard you got yourself a job. I should have known that tone, should have recognized the danger in it. But for a moment, I was naive enough to hope. I told him about the grocery store, my schedule, how the manager worked around my classes. I waited for even the smallest sign of approval, a nod, a good for you. Something. Instead, he tilted his head and said, "Well, I hope you're planning on contributing to the household." Those words sounded harmless on the surface, but I knew better. Contributing to the household was his code for something very specific. My money was already his in his mind. I tried to explain that I wanted to save for college, that I needed to start building something for my future, but he cut me off with a laugh that made my skin crawl. "College," he scoffed. "You think money grows on trees? As long as you live under my roof, everything you earn goes to this family. That's how it works." There it was, not a suggestion, not a negotiation, an order. When I got my first paycheck, I held it in my hand like it was fragile. It wasn't a lot, but I'd worked hard for it. Stocking shelves late at night, dealing with grumpy customers, dragging myself home exhausted and smelling like cleaning products and overripe fruit. That piece of paper was proof I could stand on my own 2 feet someday. But I also knew it wasn't really mine. The pride I felt was tangled up with a thick knot of dread. The minute I walked through the front door, my dad was already waiting. He didn't even bother pretending this time. He just held out his hand. No discussion, no question of what I might need, no acknowledgement that I'd done something good. I hesitated for half a second. Then I handed it over. I wasn't ready to end up on the street, and we both knew it. I told myself it was temporary, that maybe he'd ease up once he saw how serious I was about working. He didn't. If anything, it just fed whatever appetite for control he already had. My mom chimed in the way she always did, backing him up with those tired phrases she clung to like a script. "Your dad knows best. We're a family. We all pitch in." She said it like she believed it, but I knew better. There were no emergencies, no crises, no unpaid bills that I knew of. They were fine. This wasn't about survival. It was about reminding me that everything good in my life had to pass through him first. He liked to say he was teaching me responsibility. But the only lesson I was learning was that in his eyes, I was nothing more than free labor with a pulse, a resource, a wallet. I tried to push back once, just a little. I asked if I could keep a small part of my paycheck, just enough to buy necessities or save for school. His face hardened immediately. He told me it was selfish to keep money when the family needed it. He repeated that word over and over, family, as if using it often enough would turn his greed into virtue. My mom nodded along like always. The argument went nowhere. Eventually, I just shut down and went quiet. Fighting him felt like yelling into a storm. Meanwhile, at work, I heard my coworkers talk about what they were saving for. One girl was planning to buy a used car. Another was saving for a trip. They celebrated small raises and compared what they'd put aside that month. I'd smile and play along, but inside it felt like someone was pressing a bruise. I was putting in the same hours, working just as hard, but my paychecks disappeared the moment I stepped inside my house. I didn't get to dream about cars or trips. I was hoping for the luxury of buying my own snack without begging. Then there was the time I got a small raise. It wasn't huge, just a little bump in my hourly rate, but to me, it felt like the universe saying, "You're capable, you're worth something." I didn't tell my parents. I knew better by then. I kept my head down and tried to pretend nothing had changed. But my dad always had a way of finding things he wasn't supposed to see. He went through my things like it was his legal right, and one day he found one of my pay stubs. He called me into the living room, waving the paper like evidence. "You're making more now," he said, almost smug. "That means you can contribute even more." Then he launched into another speech about how lucky I was to be able to help the family. Like him, taking my raise was some kind of honor he was bestowing on me. Any time I brought up wanting to save or needing money for something specific, he twisted it into an attack. "Oh, so you think you don't need this family anymore?" he'd say. "You think you can just do whatever you want?" Guilt was his favorite weapon. He wielded it so effortlessly that for years I couldn't tell where his voice ended and my inner critic began. After enough of those conversations, I stopped asking. I stopped bringing it up at all. I'd get my paycheck, hand it over, and swallow whatever feelings came with it. Every shift at work started to feel heavier, like I was walking into a place that reminded me of everything I didn't get to keep. I watched the smiling customers and the coworkers chatting about weekend plans and felt like I was living in a parallel world where everyone else had choices and I had chains. Still, I'm stubborn. There was a part of me that refused to accept that I would never have anything of my own. So I tried something small, quiet. I started hiding a little bit of cash each week. Not much, just a few dollars here and there. I tucked it into an old book under my bed, the kind no one in my family would ever bother opening. I didn't know exactly what I was saving for. Maybe a pair of shoes that were mine. Maybe a bus ticket. Maybe just the knowledge that somewhere in this world there was something with my name on it that my dad didn't control. For a few weeks it worked. I'd come home from my shift, slip a couple of bills into that book, and feel a tiny flicker of hope. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was symbolic. It was a rebellion no one else could see. Until he found it. I came home one afternoon and immediately felt something was off. The air in the house was too still, too quiet. My dad was sitting in the living room, and in his hand was the book, the one hiding my small stash. He didn't look angry. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, he looked almost amused. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, opening the book and letting the cash peek out like a confession. I felt my stomach drop. My heart raced so fast I thought I might actually faint right there on the carpet. He stood up, pulled the money out page by page, and held it in his hand. Then, without another word, he walked past me and left the room. No shouting, no lecture, just quiet, smug victory. That silence hurt more than any yelling ever could. It was his way of saying, "Don't forget who's in charge here." I stood there staring at the empty book, feeling hollow. That little stash had been the only sliver of freedom I thought I had, and in a matter of seconds, he'd taken that too. It wasn't about the amount, it was about the message. No matter what I did, he would find a way to remind me that nothing in that house was really mine. After that, I gave up on saving at home. I was tired of fighting for scraps, tired of having every small victory turned into another loss, tired of living under surveillance that never let me breathe. I kept my head down, did my shifts, handed over my paychecks, and stopped trying to negotiate my worth with people who had already decided what I was worth. On the outside, it might have looked like I had surrendered, but I hadn't. Not really. I just shifted the battle. I stopped trying to win with hidden bills and secret stashes and started focusing on the one countdown that mattered: time. Every paycheck I handed over, every shift that blurred into the next, every quiet night where I lay awake replaying his words, I turned all of that into fuel. I was done trying to carve out freedom inside that house. I started planning my escape instead. Turning 18 felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and finally having the chance to jump, not because I wanted to fall, but because I knew I could finally fly. For years, I'd whispered to myself that once I hit that age, I would leave my parents' house for good. No more begging for scraps of freedom. No more handing over my paychecks. No more having my thoughts, clothes, friends, and privacy monitored like I was some kind of liability. 18 became my finish line, the date carved into my sanity. And when it finally came, I wasn't scared. I was ready. I'd been working nonstop at the grocery store, every hour of exhaustion serving as a reminder of why I needed to get out. Even though my dad took every paycheck, I found ways to save scraps. Tips I managed to keep, coins left in my pockets, bits of financial aid refunds eventually stacked together once I started school. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for a deposit on a tiny, run-down room in an old house with thin walls and a single dusty window. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't comfort, but it wasn't him. That alone made it priceless. Packing up my things was strangely satisfying. I didn't own much. Some thrifted clothes, a few books, notebooks full of dreams I never dared say out loud, and small personal items I'd guarded like treasure. When I started hauling my things toward the door, my parents didn't panic the way normal parents might. They didn't beg me to stay or ask why I wanted to go. Instead, they looked offended. My dad's eyes narrowed, like he couldn't believe I would dare break the unspoken rule that I belonged to him. My mom asked, "You think you're ready to be on your own?" But there was no concern in her voice, only hope that I would fail, so they could claim they had been right all along. The night before I left, my dad decided he needed one last performance. He sat me down in the living room like he had so many times before, and lectured me about how hard life out there would be. He said I wasn't prepared, that I didn't understand what real struggle was. He repeated the same lines he'd drilled into me for years, that I wasn't capable on my own, that I needed him, that the world would eat me alive. It wasn't parental concern, it was manipulation, his final attempt to plant doubt in my mind. But this time, something in me had changed. I wasn't 14 and scared anymore. I wasn't 16 and defeated. I was 18 and I was done. The next morning, I woke up early, grabbed my bag, and walked out the door without looking back. For the first time in my life, my steps didn't feel heavy. They felt like freedom. My new room was small, drafty, and barely furnished, but when I sat down on the old mattress and looked around, I felt a lightness I'd never known. The silence didn't feel threatening. It felt peaceful. No one was going to barge in. No one was going to demand to see my paycheck. No one was going to accuse me of things I didn't do. That tiny room might as well have been a palace. Living on my own hit hard, though. I was broke, really broke. My meals were ramen, canned soup, whatever was on sale. I bought a secondhand hot plate and kept my food in a cheap plastic bin because I didn't even have a fridge at first. I worked long shifts, dragging myself home late with aching feet and blurry eyes. But the exhaustion was different now. It wasn't defeat, it was ownership. I was building a life with my own hands, even if it was made of duct tape and cheap noodles. One of the first things I did was enroll in community college. I didn't have a master plan for the future yet, but I knew I wanted something better. I applied for financial aid, took out loans, and signed up for a business administration program. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like a step forward. My step, not my father's version of my life. And for once, I could make decisions without fear of punishment. That alone made every loan form worth it. Balancing school and work was brutal. I had morning classes, afternoon shifts, and late-night study sessions. Some nights, I fell asleep with my face in a textbook. But even through the exhaustion, there was something new growing in me, purpose. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was building. Every hour spent studying was an hour toward a future I chose. Every shift was money I actually got to keep. Every struggle was one I willingly accepted. Slowly, things started to change. I began making friends at school, people who actually liked me without knowing anything about the house I came from. They didn't hover. They didn't judge. They didn't try to control me. They treated me like a person, not a problem. It was strange at first, almost uncomfortable, to be around people who didn't pick apart everything I said or did. But I warmed up to it. I allowed myself to laugh more, to breathe more deeply, to trust, little by little. Eventually, I left the grocery store. One of my classmates recommended me for a serving job at a nicer restaurant, and the pay was so much better I couldn't turn it down. The work was intense, but I liked it more than I expected. The busyness kept my mind occupied, and the tips finally gave me the kind of income I never had growing up, money that didn't vanish into someone else's hands. For the first time, I could save without hiding it. I could buy myself something without fear. I could plan without being interrupted. After saving for months, I moved out of that tiny room and into a small studio apartment. It was still modest, but it had a real kitchen, a bathroom, and enough space for a small couch and a table. When I moved in, I nearly cried, not because it was beautiful, but because every square foot of that space was mine. Mine to clean, mine to decorate, mine to protect. My name on the lease felt like a declaration of my own existence. School got better too. My grades improved once the weight of my parents' expectations no longer suffocated me. I found myself enjoying classes I never thought I'd care about: marketing, management, even accounting. I was learning how to handle things on my own, and instead of fear, I felt something else blooming inside me: confidence. Every night, I'd come home exhausted but proud. I'd collapse onto my bed thinking, I'm doing this. I'm actually doing this. For so long, I'd been told I couldn't survive without my parents. But here I was, surviving, growing, thriving. I was creating a life, messy and imperfect and entirely my own. And the strangest part? I started to feel happy. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, like sunlight finding its way into a room that had been dark for too long. I'd sit at my tiny kitchen table eating the cheapest dinner imaginable, and I'd feel grateful, peaceful, like I'd finally taken my first breath after holding it for 18 years. That's why I thought I was done with them, that the past was behind me. But one thing I learned later is that people who thrive on control never let go quietly. Just when my life started to make sense, they found their way back in. I remember the day it happened with disturbing clarity. I had just finished a long shift at the restaurant, one of those nights where the last table lingered forever, the kitchen was behind, and I felt like my feet were made of stone. All I wanted was to go home, take a shower hot enough to melt stress, and collapse into bed. But when I reached my studio, there it was, a small package sitting right outside my door. No return address, no markings, nothing that hinted at where it came from. At first, I assumed it was a mix-up. I didn't order anything. I wasn't expecting anything. But my name was written clearly across the front, and a chill ran through me before I even touched it. Something in my gut knew. Something in me remembered what it felt like when danger wore the face of familiarity. I carried it inside, set it on the table, and opened it cautiously. Inside was a thick envelope, and inside that, letter after letter, pages stapled together, official-looking documents, with numbers big enough to make my vision blur. When I saw my father's name on the first page, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a birthday card. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't some sentimental attempt to reconnect. It was a debt, a massive, suffocating mountain of debt tied to a loan my father had taken out years earlier, one he never told me about, one that had ballooned into something monstrous. A failed business venture, bad decisions, interest piling up like a snowstorm. And now, according to his oh-so-familiar handwriting in the letter on top, it was my problem. He wrote like he always spoke, entitled, commanding, dismissive of anything that wasn't his own need. He said he'd always believed in me, that he knew I'd make something of myself, and now it was time for me to step up and support the family. Family, that word again, the one he used as a leash. He wrote that since I had a steady income now, since I was doing well, this responsibility would be manageable for me. As if struggling to pay rent in a tiny studio and balancing work with college meant I had thousands of dollars lying around waiting to bail him out of his own choices. It didn't even feel real at first. I sat down at my small dinner table, the documents spread across my hands, and read them over and over. I tried to convince myself I was misunderstanding something, that no sane person would dump a debt like this onto their child, especially the child they treated like a burden for 18 years. But I wasn't misunderstanding anything. He genuinely believed I should take responsibility for it. My heart pounded until I could hear it in my ears. My hands shook. I felt anger rising like boiling water. Anger, yes, but also something deeper, something uglier, betrayal. Like every fear I thought I'd left behind had found a way to claw back out of the darkness. I called him. I shouldn't have. I know that now. But I needed answers. I needed to hear what kind of twisted logic had led him to believe this was remotely my responsibility. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting for me to call. "Elena," he said, using that same calm tone he used to use right before twisting the knife. "I was wondering when you'd reach out." I asked him directly what the documents were about. He sighed dramatically, as if the whole thing was an inconvenience he'd been forced to explain to a child. Then he launched into a story about a business he tried to start, a business he was sure would succeed if not for bad luck, market conditions, and unreliable partners. He didn't take responsibility for a single choice, just painted himself as the victim of the universe. "And since your mother and I have been struggling," he said, "we figured it was time for you to step up. We've supported you your whole life. It's only fair you support us now." My whole life. Support. I almost laughed. It was either that or scream. I reminded him that he took every cent of my paychecks for years, that he didn't give me a dime for college, that everything I had I earned on my own. He brushed that off with the kind of arrogance only someone truly delusional can muster. "You wouldn't be where you are if it weren't for me," he said. "Everything you have is because I raised you. Don't forget that." I felt something break inside me, something that had been holding on out of habit more than hope. Then my mother chimed in from the background. She always entered these conversations like a ghost, silent until it was time to guilt-trip me. "Elena," she said, her voice trembling the way it always did when she wanted pity, "we need you. Things are hard. You're doing so well now. You can help. It's your duty." Duty. Another leash. Another chain they wanted to wrap around my neck. I took a deep breath and told them no, as calmly as I could. I told them it wasn't my debt, It wasn't my responsibility, and I wasn't going to take it on. My dad's tone changed instantly. "Don't be ungrateful," he snapped. "Family sticks together. You owe us. Without this family, you'd have nothing." There it was, the truth behind every word he'd ever said to me. He didn't want a daughter. He wanted property. I hung up before I could say something I couldn't take back. For the next few days, I tried to shake it off, but the anger clung to me like smoke. I kept thinking about how entitled they were, how they assumed I would drop everything to fix their mess, how even after escaping their house, they still saw me as a backup plan. Finally, I wrote them a letter. Direct, cold, unmistakably clear. Their loan was not my problem. I would not help. They would need to figure it out themselves. And this was the last time I would entertain any request from them. A few days later, my dad called again, this time screaming. He called me ungrateful, selfish, a disgrace. He said I was abandoning my family in their time of need. He said I'd regret this. I listened in silence, then hung up. When the call ended, I realized something. This was no longer about a loan. This was about control. And they were furious that I wasn't letting them have it anymore. Their chaos was just beginning. After that last explosive call, something in me clicked into place. Not fear, not guilt, but clarity. I'd spent my entire life letting their words dictate how I felt, how I moved, how I breathed, but not anymore. I blocked their numbers. I muted every notification. For the first time in my life, I chose silence over obligation. But silence didn't stop them. The messages kept coming, voicemails, texts, emails. My dad would leave these long, self-righteous rants about how I was betraying the family. He'd repeat the same lines he'd used my whole childhood, as if repetition would magically break me again. Family sticks together. You owe us. Don't forget who raised you. My mom's messages were quieter, but no less manipulative. We're worried. This isn't like you. Please don't abandon us. Worried. About what? Losing their control? Their backup plan? Their source of money? I didn't answer. Not once. A week passed. Then another. Every time my phone lit up with their names, my stomach twisted, but each time I ignored them, the twist grew a little weaker. I was building calluses where there had once only been wounds. Then my dad escalated. He left a voicemail saying, "If you don't get in touch, I'll take steps you won't like." Typical of him. Drama disguised as authority, threats dressed up as fatherly concern. Then came the letter, handwritten, ugly, in both tone and penmanship, claiming he'd start reaching out to people in my life if I didn't pay attention. He didn't specify what that meant, but I knew. He wanted to embarrass me, sabotage me, make me afraid, just like he always did. For a moment, I panicked. The thought of him showing up at my job or contacting my school or trying to worm his way into my friendship sent a cold rush through my chest. But then I remembered something important. I wasn't a kid living in his house anymore. He didn't own me. He didn't control my world, and he couldn't hurt me unless I opened the door. My brother called me around that time. We had never been incredibly close growing up, mostly because my dad ruled the house like a kingdom divided, and we were all too busy surviving. But he'd left home years before I did, and he understood exactly what our parents were like. "You ignoring them is driving them insane," he said. "Good. Keep doing it. Mom's suddenly acting like she cares, but only because she doesn't have control over you anymore." He was right. Their worry was just panic disguised with pretty words. Still, the harassment didn't stop. After weeks of their constant pressure, something inside me snapped. Not back into obedience, but into decision. I was done being intimidated. Done letting my parents' chaos leak into the life I had built with my own hands. So I did something I never imagined I'd do. I filed for a restraining order. It wasn't a choice made out of hatred. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. The same instinct that had carried me out of their house at 18. I gathered every voicemail, every threat, every guilt-laced message. I kept everything organized, documented, time-stamped. It wasn't easy. Reliving their words made my heart race, but it also reminded me why I needed to do this. When the order was granted, I sat in my car for a long time afterward, hands trembling, breath shaky. Not because I regretted it, because for the first time in my life, I had done something they couldn't undo. A judge, not my father, had legally enforced the boundaries I had spent years begging for. That piece of paper felt heavier than anything I'd ever held, heavier than the paychecks he'd stolen, heavier than the rules he'd shoved down my throat, heavier than the loan he tried to dump on me. It felt like freedom with legal weight behind it. When the restraining order was served, my dad left one final voicemail before the order made any further contact illegal. His voice was cold and venomous, dripping with resentment. "You're ungrateful. You think you're better than your family. One day you'll realize what you've done." Then the message cut off. And just like that, silence. Real silence. Not the tense, suffocating quiet of my childhood home. Not the silence that held anger like a ticking bomb. The silence was peaceful. A shelter. A beginning. At first, the quiet felt too big. Too unfamiliar. I kept expecting my phone to buzz, kept expecting drama to shatter the calm. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight, but day after day, the peace grew roots. I started sleeping better, breathing deeper, thinking more clearly. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the next explosion. The absence of their voices left space for something new, my own. I poured myself into school, into work, into building the life I wanted. And somewhere along the way, I began letting people in. Real people, kind people. People with empathy instead of entitlement. One of them became my boyfriend, steady, gentle, patient. The kind of man my father would have despised simply because he couldn't control him. Someone who supported me without conditions, who never made me feel like a burden or a disappointment. When I told him parts of my past, he didn't judge, he didn't push. He just held the space for me to breathe in it. Some friends didn't understand why I went no contact with my parents. They'd say things like, "But they're your family," or "Maybe they didn't mean it like that." I'd just smile and let them talk. People with loving families will never understand what it's like to grow up with parents who treat you like an asset instead of a child. They don't know how cruel family can sound when it's used as a weapon. Cutting off my parents wasn't easy. It hurt in ways I didn't expect. There were moments when I felt guilty, even though I knew I shouldn't. There were nights I wondered if I should have tried harder, forgiven more. But then I'd remember the years of control, the stolen paychecks, the emotional manipulation, the guilt, the threats, the debt they tried to dump on me, and the way they saw my independence as betrayal. No, I didn't owe them forgiveness. I didn't owe them loyalty. I didn't owe them anything. With time, the silence didn't just feel peaceful, it felt empowering. I started saving money for myself, making plans for the future, dreaming dreams I never allowed myself to think about before. I learned to trust my own judgment, to stand on my own without shrinking. And slowly I realized something important, something that carried more weight than the restraining order, more weight than the escape itself. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by behavior, by love, by respect, by the people who show up without demanding pieces of your soul in return. My parents never gave me that, so I gave myself something better, a life without them.